Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. Ruth is a visiting professor at a large university in Ireland, and Claire is an associate professor at a primarily undergraduate university in Northern California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss. Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Claire.
And I'm Ruth. And today we're talking about introducing students to research. But before we do that, Claire, how was your week?
My week was good. I was thinking about how, you know how you often talk about how you're reading chapter 12 and you're like, but what about chapter 13?
Yes, always.
And I was always like, I didn't quite relate to that until suddenly I realized I do that all the time in just a slightly different way. It's basically the same exact way. Like not committing to the thing that I'm working on. Like I'm writing this recommendation letter, but I'm also trying to review this paper. Yeah. And anytime I'm writing the rec letter, I'm like, oh, but what about that paper? And then so anyway, I suddenly realized that I do that thing for sure. And so I wrote these notes to myself and put it in front. And we've talked about them before in the podcast, but I feel like I never hear them too much. The one thing at a time.
Yeah.
Like right now I am writing this recommendation letter and doing things to finish them. So like,
oh yeah,
let me just finish this recommendation letter. It's gone. Now we can decide what the next thing is. Maybe it's reviewing the paper, whatever it is. But so I just feel like those two things really help me, get to try to not freak out about chapter 13 while I'm doing chapter 12.
I know. It's so hard though. And it's so, like when I have the experience of actually focusing on one thing at a time, I'm just so much better at what I'm doing.
It's so much better.
And yeah.
It's so much better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. And then doing things to finish them too, because then if they're just like all these half-done things,
yes,
then you're still working on chapter 12 and you're working on 13, and oh my goodness. But yeah.
So everyone not in physics, the other discipline I'm interested in is knitting. In knitting, they're called UFOs, so unfinished objects. So,
hilarious.
Yeah, so if you have too many UFOs, it's just very distressing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay,
that's
like
such a good
two.
analogy.
I wish we should do some kind of like motivational stickers where every time you have these things, we should make a sticker that people
that's
can buy
a great idea.
And put on their laptop. And
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Well, I want some, basically. This one's right now.
Me too.
That's what I'm doing.
Mine are just little note cards right now.
That's awesome.
So, how was your week?
My week was really good. So, So as documented on the pod, I was like having extreme burnout, basically.
Oh, yes.
And like, I honestly forgot that I liked teaching. Do you know what I mean? Like, where I was just like this, and there was times, especially with all online, and it was just, everything was like drudgery and torture, basically, like, which is strong words, but kind of appropriate. Like, I think that's how I felt. But last week I gave a seminar, and it was on like some of the kind of equity teaching things and some of the community building stuff that I did. And I completely forgot how much I enjoyed those things. And just talking about them, and people were like interested, and it just felt like I was skipping out of the seminar, and I had been dreading it so much. But I was like, I feel like there was just a part of myself I completely forgot that like I did like doing that stuff and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It was just really energizing to remember it. And I think too, because I'm having such burnout, I feel sort of just apologetic all the time. Like I don't have much to offer. Do you know what I mean? And suddenly I was like, oh, like maybe there is, like maybe I do have something to contribute to the world. Like this is really dramatic. But I honestly had forgotten that, and it was just like, oh, I just can't teach, hate teaching. And so
no, totally.
And even, I find it very anxiety inducing teaching in person, but it's just so much more fun. Like so much more fun, and just chatting and eavesdropping, my favorite thing to do on the students.
I love eavesdropping on student groups. It's so good. I love it when they teach each other something, and oh my goodness.
Well, you're a lot more noble than I'm. Like, I swear gossip and stuff. But you can't do that in breakout rooms. And
nope.
I very much appreciate all the things Zoom gave us and all of that, but I just hated it so, like, so much of the joy went out of teaching, and I don't feel like it's back, but I definitely am feeling little sprouts coming up in my teaching soul. So anyway, that's very dramatic. I'm using all the dramatic language, but
no,
it was really good to remember. And I think I have that every time I give a seminar on anything. You're like, oh, I did know something about that. That was
so. I knew something about that, and I'm actually excited and interested.
Totally.
Hopefully, if it's a topic you are excited, and that's so wonderful to remember the thing, because it's so easy, you know. Definitely when we're teaching virtually on Zoom and in a pandemic, but I think anytime it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, like need to grade this thing or whatever, and forget why we're doing it.
Yeah.
And so it's so wonderful to have that reminder that you do like it and you are good.
Yeah, it was really, so tell me, do you have a quote for us this week?
I do, and it's from this book, The 4 Agreements, by Don Miguel Ruiz, and which the subtitle is A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom. And I think I mentioned it a few days ago, or a few episodes ago, but Ralph has been reading it, and anyway, it's great. So the 4th agreement is always do your best, and I just wanted to read a little bit from it. Under any circumstance, always do your best, no more and no less. But keep in mind that your best is never going to be the same from one moment to the next. Everything is alive and changing all the time, so your best will sometimes be high quality, and other times it will not be as good. When you wake up refreshed and energized in the morning, your best will be better than when you are tired at night. Your best will be different when you are healthy as opposed to sick. Regardless of the quality, keep doing your best, no more and no less than your best. It's just a nice reminder.
That honestly makes me feel a bit emotional, like a bit weepy, because it's so... I mean, and it really speaks to kind of what I was just talking about, but just the madness we've all been through. But the idea that we're somehow robot people who will always have the same level of productivity. And it's such a source of stress in my life to be, and I do this all the time when I was in undergrad, where I was like, no, but last week I managed to do 2 homeworks in one day, so why can't I do it this week? And just this idea that like your best or your energy levels or whatever will ebb and flow. And then not to feel hysterical and desperate when you don't have your best is like, you know what, if you don't have a whole bunch of energy, to not be like, oh no, it's happening. It's like the beginning of the end, and just like, well, maybe I need to have a nap, or I'll come back to this tomorrow, or whatever it is. But just, yeah.
It's so easy, I think, you know, you have those wonderful moments where you do 2 homework assignments in a day or whatever it is, and then you're like, okay, that's the standard that I must meet all the time.
Yes. Yeah. That's totally.
Yeah.
And it's just like the whole point of us is that we're not robots, right? Like the whole point is like, because we talk about like we put that on another sticker. Just like the whole point of us is that we're not robots. But like, you know what I mean? That we actually have things we bring to this job that are not just getting an AI robot to read out slides. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like we do have, but then with that comes differing energy levels or whatever.
Yeah. Wow, and that is totally fine.
Yes. I love it. That's amazing. Okay, so what are we talking about today?
So we're talking about introducing students to research, which I've been thinking about lately because I have I have a bunch of new research students this semester. Not only do I have 3 new research students to me, but I also have research students who are newly in the lab and had been previously doing data. So I was just suddenly like, what's the best way to introduce these students to research? So I've been thinking about that and just thought it'd be useful to chat about it.
Yes. And so this is interesting for me because I don't have any research students at the moment, but like an opportunity came up a few weeks ago to maybe have some. And because I was just too overwhelmed with the thought of introducing them to research, I said no. So this is kind of very timely for me as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So do you want to tell me what is working for you?
Sure. This was a funny one because I wrote out a bunch of little tiny things that were working, and then I was like, these are all tiny and only minorly working, and I crossed them all out. And anyway, maybe I'll mention some of them later. But what I finally landed on as actually something that I really do find effective is it works well when I work with the students for the first few times that they're in the lab.
I hear you, and I'm just like trying to suppress a groan because I'm like, but then you have to go in the lab. But no, I hear you. Like, I know that's the best thing to do, but yeah.
I know. Well, but it really, I don't know. So of course, I can introduce their project, but then I can also introduce the general techniques of working in the lab. I get to know them a little bit better. And they get to ask questions freely as they think of them because, we're hanging out in the lab for an hour together or whatever.
And then I'm also, like, an hour? No, sorry. I'm just going to keep it like, oh. But yes, you're dead right.
Yeah. So, okay, and also I spot things that I might not think to tell them.
Yes,
they're sticking their fingers in bottles or something, and I'm like, oh, by the way, that's not what we do in this, so that kind of thing. So, yeah. I think maybe I was resisting it too because of the time investment up front, but in my thoughts reflecting on it now, I think it is an investment.
I bet it's totally worth it. And yeah. Because
and once we've been in the lab together for a few weeks, and I'm not talking hours and hours a day or anything, I'm just talking they come in once a week and maybe I'm with them for an hour and a half or whatever. And then But then at that point, I've seen them in the lab. They've been in the lab. They've asked all their questions. And then I think I can release them.
Yeah.
And they'll be comfortable and effective and not sticking their fingers in bottles and all these wonderful things. So,
just a side note, because I'm a bit giddy, but I want to come and have you teach me chemistry lab and be like, no, we don't do that, Ruth, and just to see how patient you are. You're like, no, we're not pouring the acid on the floor or whatever. So just imagine you being very patient and relaxed in the face of crazy students putting their fingers in things. Yeah.
Well, it's just, there's things. Yeah, those are I mean, there are lots of things, like just an example is we're washing bottles with soap. And at home you wash bottles with soap you wash glasses and stuff with soap. And but then there's so like I guess what I'm trying to say is obviously you don't want to pour acid on the floor, I would hope, but there's things that are not obvious that would mess up the samples or something, So, yeah.
Yeah, I had with the student, and we were like using just so carefully with everything. And then at one point they just picked up the chip with their fingers. You're like, ooh, yeah, no, we're not, don't do that. But
exactly.
It seems so clear to me because we were going to all this trouble with the tweezers, but it obviously wasn't clear enough. So, yeah.
And so exactly, if you hadn't been in the lab with that student, they might have been doing that all semester and you would have not even known. And they wouldn't have known.
You're just measuring fingertip oils instead of whatever you think you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I agree with you. Of course, that is time. But I do think...
You're right, though.
And also you can have multiple students at once. Like, I really like having 2 or 3 students doing that kind of thing because then... I mean, that just really doubles or triples the investment, We're all learning the same things. We're all asking the questions. I'm getting to know them all. And now they're all at a level of training where they can go off and do their own thing. I don't know. Yeah. Ideally, I think you would have a student who was trained, who you did trust, who could train the next student, potentially. I just am not at that point right now because nobody's been in the lab for...
But I think it's cool, too. Like, do you ever worry... Like, okay, the stuff I was trying to get my students to do, like... I was rusty, do you know what I mean? And so I think some of my reluctance as well is like, I don't know how to do this. I hope they just figure it out themselves. But really, that wasn't, Yeah. So it's good to keep yourself in there, right? Because I can imagine that if you just had a student who you could always rely on for 10 years and then suddenly you didn't and you were like, oh, wow, how does this work? So
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what's working for you with introducing students to research?
So, these are things that have worked. This is my list of small things that have medium worked, but I would not necessarily. So one thing that I think has been good is to just take the time to do a talk to the students, like a research talk.
Okay.
And I think in the past, there was times when I didn't do that and I got them to read, but it was just better to just do the talk, and so... I even started when students were approaching me of having this was on Zoom, but a big evening where we did the talk and then they could see if they were interested after
Interesting,
that.
that's cool.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
And
I
then,
like that.
so that was really good. And I just have the same old talk that I always do. So, you know, and I think I thought it would be boring for the other people, but then I think it's good to hear it over again because I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, they didn't get it the first time. I think
they have a lot more context now as well, you know?
And the stuff that I was doing that was on my PhD stuff, the old thesis is really handy because that's like a lot more information in those chapters. So asking them to read a couple of chapters from the thesis is good. And then I guess papers to read, but that has never been a successful thing for me. Having, like, I worked with someone a long time ago who used to have like weekly papers assigned to their research group, and they did a really good job of like holding people accountable and having like a reading group and discussion afterwards. I have never had that success. Okay, I'm talking about that in the wrong section. But so yeah, I think like just doing a talk, and then I think now that you're saying it, anytime I have gone in the lab with students, it was really paid off. But sometimes I did really struggle sometimes to find the time or the time windows when they were available and I was available and all that sort of stuff.
That's fascinating. I love the idea of a talk. I have given students papers or a little bit of a proposal or something that I want them to read that's going to give them the context for what they're doing. It hadn't occurred to me to give a research talk. That sounds
you know,
cool.
Is it different for you? Like, so at the time I'm thinking of, I had like 8 students working on the same project with you know, but for you, do you have different projects? Like...
Yeah, I mean, it depends how far up you go. I mean, of course, they're all under the same umbrella if you go far enough up. But yeah, I mean, that's true. Like this semester, I gave a couple students a bit of a proposal because they're doing part of the work of that proposal. And then I gave other students this paper because they're trying to replicate the method of this paper. And so, yeah, we could talk about trace metals in general, but they're kind of doing totally different projects with respect to trace metals. But it still might be useful for them to hear a bit about trace metals in general.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's interesting. I think you do a really good job in your research group of bringing all the students together and they hear from each other. Like you often, if I recall correctly, had meetings where different students would present about whatever they were working on. And that seems really cool.
Yeah. And again, I think, honestly, so I had a really amazing senior student. And I would make Google Slides, and then she would make sure everyone put up their slides. So everyone would have to have at least one slide updating about their work. So that was really effective.
That's really cool. Yeah. That sounds awesome. And maybe even if you didn't have the one stellar student who was always in charge, I wonder if you could rotate who was in charge or just appoint somebody to be in charge. I don't know. But that sounds awesome. I feel like that's something I'm missing in my group right now is the interaction between all the different people working on stuff. And so maybe I'll think about that.
I like it.
So, what am I working on? Is
that
where we're at?
Sorry. I was like,
I was going to ask you, and then I was like, wait, no, it's me. So, I asked Ralph his first experience with research, and his first time in the lab really spoke to me about the perfect introduction to a research project lab. And so Ralph was working with particulate trace metals, and to get particulate trace metals from seawater, you have to filter them through this filter, and then you have all the particles on the filter, and then you need to cut the filter into pieces and analyze the filter.
Oh.
So that's the general procedure. Now, of course, you have a new undergrad in the lab, you don't want to give them samples that are really important that they might mess up because they don't know what they're doing yet. Yeah. So that makes sense. But the project that Ralph's advisor, Jim Bishop, gave him was to take the filters. They were deciding, they were thinking about getting this new type of filter. So just take filters, no particles, no sample yet. Practice cutting bits out. And then this is part of the project that he could do where he's testing these new filters and seeing whether they work just as well or not as the old filters. And so I love it because you're in the lab with the filters that you're, in the future going to work with samples, but you're practicing cutting the filters into pieces, you're practicing digesting them and analyzing them without damaging any samples. So there's no risk, And
it's cool that, did he have the autonomy over, that was his project?
That was his project. Yes, cool. Exactly.
Because I think that's...
So I just love... Yeah. So it's it's not only no risk, but it's excellent training, because this is actually something you'll do with samples later. And if it works out, you'll get really good information, because you actually do want to know the different filters. And this is a little project that would be really useful that now is owned by this new undergrad.
Yeah.
So I just thought that's like perfect. That's exactly what I want to aim for my undergrad projects, you know?
I mean, I think that's so key, because I think something I struggle with, and especially lately because I didn't have a direction, but is the feeling that the work they're doing is meaningful. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And if you're like, oh yeah, we totally need this information, but it's not super dangerous, like if you mess this up, it's not going to be like someone's whole PhD down the toilet. So, you know, whatever, like, but so I think that's great. If there's a way of designing projects that people can have autonomy over and it is meaningful, that would be amazing.
And yeah, autonomy, meaningful, and like good training for now you can actually, like, if you get through this project of testing the filters and you get good data, well, now it seems like you know what you're doing with filters, and maybe you could do. So anyway, and I was thinking, so I have these two groups of students right now, and one of them, I feel like it was pretty good. I gave them something similar. I want them to develop this method. I mentioned it briefly before. It's a flow injection analysis method. They have to connect all these tubes together. From my perspective, I want the method to exist in the lab. However far they get through making it happen will be positive. Hopefully, they get it to the point of actually working, and that would be wonderful. But even if they just get it halfway working, that'll be good for them and good for me. So that seems pretty good. But then my other group of students, they're doing something essential, very useful, good training, but maybe doesn't seem... it's not really an experiment. It's not very exciting. What they're doing right now is cleaning a bunch of bottles for trace metals that we absolutely need to be cleaned for trace metals for this cruise that I'm going on. And in the process, they're learning not to stick their fingers in the bottles, how to clean with the different acids, you know, all these trace metal clean important techniques that are going to be useful later. But from their perspective of, am I doing something exciting? Well, no, I'm cleaning bottles, you know? So
yeah,
they're not going to clean bottles for the whole semester. They're going to do some other things that are their projects that are going to... So anyway, I just feel like I have a little bit of potential improvement to be done there.
I think that's, I mean, it's like you're saying, it's not going to be for the whole semester. But I remember somebody saying to me about students, because like, do you ever get the research students who are like, oh, I want to do research with you? And you're like, okay. And then they're like, this sounds really boring. Like, I thought I was going to be like smashing electrons together. And you're like, nope, not here. And someone told me like they deliberately give someone kind of a tedious task that needs a lot of precision. And then like, I'm really like against weeding people out. But, you know, still, it's like, this is like research is... Right. And for you, like, there must be so much stuff you have to be incredibly meticulous about. I mean, that's terrible. And I'm like, not for me. Who cares in physics? But like in computational stuff, it's a bit different. But like, sure, you know, that's, yeah.
I mean, exactly. These bottles need to be cleaned. That is an essential part of the research project. It's like not, it's like really, it's part of the research. It has to be done. And it does involve all these techniques for being clean that apply more broadly. And so, yeah, exactly. It's, that's interesting. Yeah, you don't want to weed people out necessarily, but it is true that you're not always smashing electrons together. You also have to build the apparatus that smashes the electrons together, and I don't know, have to find the right size screw or whatever it is, and like, you know, like that's also has to happen.
Like I had a really, really, really boring project, which is looking at an image and then manually measuring all of the angles of the objects in the image. And it is super boring, but it's still something we needed to do. Right. You know, and essential it's like, part. But people, I like had students who were like, this is too boring, I don't want to do it. And you're like, sure, but I'm not going to do it. So can you do it? Because I don't want to. But like, yeah. But I do think like, ideally we could convey... Why? And, you know, it's totally fine if all the students don't want to do this, but ideally we'd convey this is actually really crucial, and I know that it's tedious, but it's like you are really contributing to this research project,
hope, and so some, I imagine some people might be excited to be contributing to this bigger picture, and they're picturing the bigger picture while doing the measuring the angles or the cleaning the bottles or whatever.
Well, and not to be a total downer, right? But I mean, there is a real phenomenon of people going to grad school thinking that it will be more undergraduate classes and then being like, I really hate research, it's really boring. So there is sort of no harm sometimes in this is what research is like. And sometimes it's, you know, I don't know, like in your PhD, how many moments were actually like exciting discoveries? Because for me, it was very small. Do you know what I mean? And the
sure,
rest
you have
of
to
it
do
was,
tons of bottle cleaning and tons of analysis before you get the data, and then you process it, and then you can figure out something interesting. Yeah,
totally.
And that's just fun. It has. I mean, if it was easy, it would already be done.
Exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, what's I feel like I've just been down on research in general. But
no, I know we're like research is the worst. But it's so great. It is so great, and like looking back and having been so meticulous and diligent and all of the things taking so long, like it's deeply satisfying when it works. And you know, I think and you know, I'm just thinking like when those students go into their PhD labs and their advisors are like, wow, you have a lot of skills in preparing these things, like that's going to be great.
Totally.
Yeah. So I think for me, a couple of things that I'm working on. One is I have yet to convey to students the importance I believe about lab book.
Okay.
Actually, recently on a different episode, you mentioned looking through your old lab books for information. And I don't know, like, are people doing research in different ways now where they don't record information in lab books? Or I don't know, but I've never managed to like convey and enforce the importance of the lab notebook, which I really believe is so important. But I somehow haven't done that, and I haven't introduced people to that. And the other thing, which kind of is that as well, is I don't have enough accountability. So, you know, I just wish, again, my cosplay is Snape, but like, I wish I could be like, what do you mean you didn't read that chapter? I told you to read the chapter. You needed to read the chapter. Or, what do you mean you didn't write this down in your lab book? Like, this is really important. You have to do it. So I think what I need to do is think about the things I think are really important. But yeah, sometimes in my efforts to be nice and not scare people off, I'm also not holding boundaries about,
totally,
you know, you did need to read this thing and we do need to get started.
Easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, like, once you establish in your own mind what are the key important things that they absolutely must do, maybe that can just be an explicit thing at the beginning of the semester or something.
Yeah.
I wonder if that would help.
Like, I did start, the first couple of times I had a research group, there was people who just weren't coming half the time to the meetings, and it was just super annoying because like you'd say stuff and then have to repeat it, and like, so then I did put in this grade policy, like if you miss X amount of meetings, you'll like generally get an excellent grade in your research, but it will go down each time you miss a meeting. And so maybe I just need to do that sort of thing, but like decide, that became super clear to me that was important and irritating if it didn't. So maybe that's what I need to do.
Yeah. I feel like my approach has just been, if it's not working out, if the student doesn't seem dedicated and isn't doing the things, then I don't keep them in my group the next semester.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's I think that's a good approach, but I feel like maybe your way of having some warning signs that the students know that that's happening.
Well,
it seems nice.
Yeah. Well, I think I know a lot of people who are like, you get a semester basically, and then, you know, otherwise no kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, the lab book. I was thinking
tricky.
when I was...
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry?
Doing research with undergrads is tricky, for sure.
I was thinking when I was going through my old lab books, I was like, maybe I should be keeping lab books. Like, should I just have my lab book when all the undergrad... Yeah, like, should... I was wondering about lab books, too. Like, should we have a communal lab book?
Oh.
Or should it just be my lab book, but I try to write down... I don't know.
What they're doing, and yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Because at one point we did have a communal lab book, and it was nice to leave notes for each other. Like, I'd be like, these are some things that somebody should do. You know, whoever has time, please get these things done.
Oh,
and then
cool.
Other people would write questions like, where did this thing go? I thought I left it on the counter, but, you know, so that was kind of fun to have little notes that we could leave for each other.
Yeah.
Which is kind of different than a lab notebook, but it also kept a little log of what people were working on. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a student the other day who was talking about the labs that we were doing, and they were saying like, oh yeah, back in the day they had to have like a lab notebook for even doing these experiments, and they said like everyone would always have this one glue stick during the session that was like, and I was remembering like gluing in graphs and like all that stuff, which I got out of the habit of because I was like, well, I have them all, but like I never look at them in the same way that I used to when they were like pasted into a notebook, and then you would go back and review it and stuff. So, but then I don't have a lab notebook on the go, so yeah, maybe I need to sort out my own lab notebook house before I start getting in other people's business about it. So yeah. Well, thanks, Claire. I feel like this one we could do again next time because there's so much to talk about. And
totally.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people you know if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.